The battlefield had fallen silent 3 hours ago, but the scent of burnt plasma and scorched earth still hung thick in the air. Bruno crouched beside his makeshift medical station, hands trembling as he inventoried what little supplies remained. The Coalition's retreat had been chaotic, leaving him stranded in the ruins of what had once been a Crithian outpost. He didn't hear it approach. Few ever did. The Vortex moved like smoke despite its massive frame, 800 pounds of muscle, chitin armor, and predatory intelligence. Bruno only became aware of its presence when a low rumble, deeper than thunder, vibrated through his chest. He froze. Turning slowly, Bruno found himself staring into 6 obsidian eyes set in a wedge-shaped head. The creature's maw could have swallowed him whole. Its reputation preceded it across a dozen star systems. Vortex, the war beasts of the Crithian Empire, apex predators bred for 1,000 generations to hunt, kill, and terrify. This one stood at the edge of his makeshift camp, its massive body tense. But it wasn't attacking. In its jaws, held with surprising gentleness, hung a small form. A cub. The adult Vortex took one deliberate step forward, then another. Bruno's training screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The creature lowered its head and placed the cub on the ground before him, then retreated 2 paces. Its eyes never left Bruno's face. The cub was dying. Even from where he knelt, Bruno could see the massive wound across its flank where enemy fire had torn through flesh and bone. The small creature's breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. Its pale blue blood pooled beneath it, stark against the ash-gray dirt. "Oh no," Bruno whispered. "No, no, no." The adult Vortex made a sound, not a growl, but something else. Something that transcended species. A mother's plea. Bruno looked from the cub to the mother, his mind racing. Vortex were enemies of humanity. They'd torn through Coalition forces on a dozen worlds. Protocol dictated he should defend himself or flee. The creature could kill him in seconds, but all he saw was a mother watching her child die. "All right," he said softly, moving slowly toward his medical kit. "All right, let me see what I can do." The mother didn't move, but her breathing quickened. Bruno knelt beside the cub, his hands hovering over the wound. It was catastrophic. The blast had shattered ribs, punctured what he assumed was a lung analog, and caused massive hemorrhaging. Any human with injuries like this would be beyond saving with his limited supplies, but he had to try. "I need you to stay calm," Bruno said, not sure if the mother could understand standard. "I'm going to help. I promise." He grabbed his scanner first, running it over the cub's body. The readout was grim, but it gave him anatomical data. Similar cardiovascular system to mammals, but with redundancies humans lacked. The cub had 3 smaller hearts instead of 1 large one. 2 were still beating. Bruno worked with hands steadier than he'd expected. He administered a synthetic coagulant he'd used on Terran canines, praying the biochemistry was compatible enough. The bleeding slowed. He used regenerative foam to stabilize the shattered ribs, then carefully, so carefully, inserted a breathing tube to bypass the damaged lung. The mother watched every movement with laser focus. Once, when Bruno's hand slipped and the cub whimpered, she surged forward with a snarl that could have shattered stone. Bruno didn't flinch. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it hurts, but I'm helping. Trust me." The mother stopped, her massive body trembling with barely contained violence, but she didn't attack. She settled back, watching an hour passed. Then 2. Bruno used every trick he'd learned in field medicine, improvising with equipment meant for humans, adapting techniques from veterinary texts he'd studied as a hobby back on Earth. The cub's vital signs stabilized, then slowly, impossibly, began to improve. When the cub's eyes finally opened, 6 small black orbs focusing on Bruno with confusion, he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Hey there, little one," he whispered. "Welcome back." The mother's reaction was immediate. She moved forward, her massive head pushing Bruno aside with surprising gentleness. She nuzzled her cub, making soft chirruping sounds that seemed impossible from such a fearsome creature. The cub responded weakly, pressing against its mother. Bruno stood, backing away to give them space. His entire body ached, and his hands were covered in blue blood. But he smiled. The mother lifted her head, looking at Bruno. In those alien eyes, he saw something he understood perfectly. Gratitude. She stood, carefully lifting her cub by the scruff of its neck. Before turning to leave, she did something Bruno would never forget. She lowered her head, pressed her massive forehead against his chest for just a moment, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, then disappeared into the ruins as silently as she'd come. Bruno stood alone in the ruined outpost as the twin moons rose over the devastated landscape. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of his units searching for him, their voices calling his name. But he remained still for another moment, staring at the pool of blue blood at his feet, thinking about mothers and children, about enemies and healers, about the impossible things humans tried when someone was dying. Evangeline found him 20 minutes later, leading the search team through the rubble. She stopped short when she saw him, taking in his blood-covered uniform and the strange expression on his face. Bruno, thank God. We thought, she paused. Is that Vorthek's blood? He looked at her, then at the massive tracks leading away into the darkness, and smiled. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, it is. Are you hurt? Did you fight one? Bruno shook his head, gathering his medical supplies. No, I saved one. Evangeline stared at him like he'd lost his mind, but she didn't press. She'd known Bruno long enough to recognize that look. The one he got when he'd done something impossible and was still processing it himself. As they walked back to the coalition lines, Bruno glanced back once at the ruins. Somewhere in the darkness, a war beast moved through the night, carrying her cub to safety, saved by the hands of what should have been her enemy. And in that moment, Bruno understood something fundamental about humanity's place in the galaxy. They weren't the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most technologically advanced, but when the impossible needed attempting, when compassion demanded action despite danger, when a mother's desperate eyes begged for help, humans couldn't help but try. That, perhaps, was what made them truly extraordinary at the end.